everyone, Susanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is going to be how I sewed up my button-down skirt. I made the video for the patterning of this one last week, so that should be live on my channel now, so have a look for that, or I shall link it down below. But if you want to see how I sewed it, let's get started.
And for cutting out, I'm starting with my pockets. My lining, I have 2 layers of cotton lawn fabric underneath my pattern piece. My pocket bag, I have 2 layers of denim fabric underneath my pattern piece. And for the front, I have 2 layers of denim fabric underneath my pattern piece. And on to notches. I have a notch at the top and bottom of my placket, one at the seam allowance, one at the interfacing and one at the button. A notch at the top of my dart, both of my legs, and a notch at the side of my pocket. And then for that dart, I'm just popping a pin in at the point of the dart, marking it with some chalk, and then I'll remove my pattern piece and mark in my dart legs. So I'm lining my ruler up with those notches you just seen me mark, drawing in my dart legs, and ready to pin. So I'm just making sure that those chalk lines are matched up on both sides and popping a pin through one side, out the other, and back in through again. Trying to be careful that those dart legs are lined up the whole way down. Popping a pin at the point of the dart on the horizontal. And that's my front ready for sewing. And onto the back, my fabric underneath is on the fold, and I just have a couple of notches at the bottom of my dart legs, marking them here in exactly the same way as I did the front, and ready to stitch. So starting with the front, back stitching at the bottom of the dart legs, running the stitches right along that chalk line and pulling my threads. Tying my threads off. And of course I do the same on the other side of the front. And onto the back, same again, back stitching, trying to follow those chalk lines the whole way down, letting my threads run off at the end, and tying. So that's my darts all pressed nicely in the back, and the front, same again, pressed nicely. And now I'm ready for the pockets. So to prep for placing the pockets, I'm just adding a little bit of interfacing along my pocket openings on the skirt outer. And then lining up my lining fabric with the outer fabric right sides together and pinning. And stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance the whole way down. Back stitching at the start and the end. And that's how that looks. And now I just need to finish that edge. So for the edges on this skirt, I've decided to bias bind. So I'm just making sure that the cut edges on the bias binding line up with the edge of my outer fabric. And just running that binding the whole way along. Back stitching at the start and the end. And that's how that looks. So after a press, nice and neat. So now I'm ready to understitch. So my seam underneath is pressed to the right hand side and I'm stitching directly through the lining to that seam underneath, just a couple of millimeters away from the outer fabric, so from that denim. And again, nicely pressed. And now for the placket. So the notches I snipped earlier, I'm going to use those now to line up my interfacing. So I'm just interfacing to the right hand side of my seam allowance. And now I'm ready to press my placket just like you see here on the top of the screen. So I'm going to press first of all my 1 centimeter seam allowance. The whole way down. And then lining up those notches again, I'm going to press my interface piece. And that's my placket prepped so far. So now I just want to finish off the placket at the hem. So to do that, I'm folding my placket at my notch, right sides together with the outer. I'm keeping my seam allowance on top and just popping a pin in at the hem level, so 1 inch up from the bottom, and then just running a stitch line along that, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's how that looks. And then to reduce the bulk at the corner there, I'm just going to snip away some of that excess fabric, fold the whole thing right side out, give it a nice press, and that's how that looks on both sides. Super neat and tidy, so pleased with that. And now back to the pockets again. So I want to place my pocket bag underneath my outer fabric and line it up with the pocket lining. And pin, and ready to stitch. So I'm starting at the side seam. I'm stitching here with about half my usual seam allowance. So I'm at about 5 millimeters from the edge, the whole way around that nice curve of the pocket, up to the top and across to the edge of the lining. Back stitching at the start and the end. And again, I want to finish off that edge. So off camera, I've went ahead and done that with that bias finish. And now just to hold the pockets in place, I want to run some tacking stitches along the top and across the side seam, or down the side seam I should say. So I'm stitching very close here to the edge of the fabric, just to hold that pocket bag in place, and across the top. Again, just to hold everything in place. That will make it easier when I continue with the construction. So that's my pockets in on both sides. I just need to finish off my edges. So again, I've ran that bias tape along the side seams of the back and the front. I've got my placket all nicely prepped, got my darts in, my pockets all in place, ready to sew up the side seams. So I'm just laying my front over my back, right sides together and pinning, ready to stitch. So stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, trying to stick to that 1 centimeter the whole way along. And that's how that looks. So it just needs a nice press now, which I've went ahead and done here. And now for the hem, again I've ran that bias right the whole way along the hem edge and pinned up my hem allowance. So pinned up my hem by 1 inch. And now I'm going to run some top stitching the whole way down the placket, along the hem and up the other side of the placket. And I'm using this sort of golden coloured thread. So back stitching at the start, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, so I think it's about a 4 millimeter or so I'm using here. And I'm running those stitches from the inside right along the edge of that placket, from the top the whole way to the bottom. So that's how that looks. And then for the hem, back stitching just at the side of the hem and running those stitches just along the edge of the bias tape. Same stitch length here, so 4 millimeter, back stitching at the start and the end, and of course I do the same on the other side of the placket. Nice and neat. So now I'm ready to pop on my waistband. So for the cutting out, I just had one layer of fabric underneath this pattern piece, and I'm just now marking in my notches. So I have notches at my side seam, centre back, on both sides, and also on the horizontal in the centre. That's going to give me my fold line. So I need to prep the waistband before stitching. So I've just placed a little bit of interfacing along one side of the waistband. I've pressed up my seam allowance on one side, and now just folding the waistband in half on the horizontal, matching up my edges and pinning. Doing the same on both sides, ready to stitch. So I'm stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, and that's how that looks. And then just holding the corner and pulling everything right side out. And after a nice press, this is how it looks. So it's now ready to pin to the top of my skirt. So I'm making sure my edges match up at the centre front, lining up the edges of the waistband and the skirt, matching up my notches the whole way across, so at my side seam, centre back and side seam again, and ready to stitch. So I'm stitching here, starting at the centre back and working my way along to the centre front at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end, and I'll do the same on the other side. But that's how that looks. And once both sides are done, this is how it looks. So I just need to finish the waistband by folding over that 1 centimeter seam allowance I pressed up earlier, making sure it covers the seam you just seen me stitch, and pinning. So I'm sewing this time from the top of the fabric, again starting at the centre back and working my way right along the edge of that seam to the centre front. And that's how that looks. So super neat and tidy, and from the inside, so that seam's all nicely covered. And you see it a bit better here. So nice and neat. And now I'm ready to pop my buttons on. So in preparation for that, I need to measure where I want my buttonholes to be. So I know I need a button in the centre of my waistband, and then I've just measured down about 1/2 inch from the waistband edge, and then from there 3.5 inch intervals, and I'm just popping a pin in to mark. So that's where I want my buttonholes to be. So I'm just popping my needle down exactly where that pin mark was, and just sewing the buttons in the usual way. I'm using that gold coloured thread again, and that's how my buttonholes look. So the whole way up. And now to open up those buttonholes, I'm popping a pin in at the edge and just using my seam ripper to open up the little gap between the thread. So that pin is stopping the seam ripper from ripping the whole way through my fabric. And now just to pop some fray check on those ripped open edges. So this will just stop fraying too much. And once that fray check is all dried, I'm ready to mark where I want my buttons to be. So in preparation for that, I've just pinned my placket top and bottom together, and I'm just using a tiny little bit of chalk to mark a little dot in the centre of each of my buttonholes. And once I've done that for all, this is how it looks. So I'm using jeans buttons for this, and the jeans buttons have a little screw you'll see in a second, and the screw slots through a hole that you pierce in your fabric. So I'm using these pliers to first of all pierce the hole. So I'm just lining up my pliers with my chalk mark and creating that little hole. And once they're all done, that's how it looks. And then that screw that I mentioned, I'm going to pop that in underneath so that the screw's sitting out from the fabric on the outside. Line up my button and then quite vigorously I'm going to hammer this into place. So that's my first button on. I'm going to do exactly the same with the rest. And that is all of my buttons in place. And this little skirt complete. So I have my buttons, my buttonholes, my pockets, my darts and my waistband. That nice top stitching the whole way down. Same thing on the back. And then on the inside, nicely finished with that bias. Super neat and tidy with all of those edges either bias finished or tucked in underneath. Love that. And this is how it looks on. So I love this for a number of reasons. Number one, it's a really basic pattern, quite quick to sew up. So you've just seen it's quite straightforward. Made up in this denim, it's super casual, but the pattern itself could be made up in any fabric to dress it up a bit. I've teamed it up here with just a plain white t-shirt and a little pair of plimsolls, and I love how casual this is. This is going to be perfect for me for spring, summer, and even with a pair of tights in winter.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you in my next one. Bye folks!